The homeless crisis is a tiny fraction of the population of the United States. And let's not make that a major part of the housing problem in the United States.
I think it's very symptomatic.
I'm not at all convinced that there's any evidence suggesting that the private system cannot provide adequate housing. I think there is a good case to be made that there are poor people in this country, and the government obviously has to help them out. We all agree on that. But should they be doing it by building housing or by giving them income and permitting them to spend as they see fit? And I see no evidence from the U.S. or any other country that we're better off when the government takes a major role in housing or any of these other particular activities that allocate resources.
And what role has been played in the difficulty of getting housing? By government interventions, by rent control, by excessive building code regulations, many of which are designed to protect the interests of special groups.
Look, Milton,
those have played a very large role.
The homeless people are homeless because they're poor and they're out of work. They're not homeless because of rent control.
I beg your pardon. Not all of them aren't. Of course there are some like that, but the existence of rent control has certainly increased the number of homeless.
Many people are homeless because they're mentally ill. I mean, there are lots of, but the homeless is a tiny fraction. Housing policy in the United States should not be oriented around the homeless, because that's a tiny part of the problem in any major city, and certainly outside of major cities. If you look at the bulk of housing in the United States, I see no evidence that that cannot be adequately provided by the private sector.
Let's talk about incentives, because I know that both of you like to talk about incentives a lot.
You do too.
Well, I think incentives are terribly important. And Milton says in the show, and I agree with him, that we have to choose between taking orders from the top down or incentives at the bottom. Now, Milton's idea of how do you get the incentives down at the bottom is essentially a view of an economy in which individuals, through their ownership of property, can own the results of their hard work and their innovation. It's a great idea. It doesn't exist anywhere, and it can't exist. The idea, I mean, when I read your stuff, Milton, when I watch you on TV, I think, Milton has this idea of, Charlie Brown and Linus are going to have a lemonade stand, and Lucy's going to have another lemonade stand, and that's your idea of capitalism. But that's a myth. That's not what capitalism is. We don't have thousands and millions of little firms competing on a level playing field. We have giant industrial corporations that use their power to their own advantage and to the disadvantage of others. And that's what you have to be able to deal with if you want to be relevant to the modern world. That's what the countries that I talked about, Sweden, Korea, Norway, Japan, are very good at doing, dealing with the problem of economic power so that the power of those institutions can be used by and large for public good. If you ignore them with this lemonade stand capitalism myth, you're simply giving those powerful centers of wealth and affluence free rein.
It's it's a strange thing that not a single one of the countries you've described has a standard of living as high as that of the United States with respect to the bulk of its population.
Yes, and the United States got its standard of living through precisely the policies that you've opposed, such as protecting our industrial base from Alexander Hamilton through the McKinley tariff, to subsidizing the railroads.
Part of you, I'd be very happy to go back to 19th century U.S. policy. It was a tiny part. The government, sure, they did some things, and maybe
they built canals and so on.
I agree. I had a colleague at Columbia who did a lot of work in that area. But it was a tiny part of the economy. And let's go back to resources that went through the government at that time. What was it? 10% of the maximum? The largest employer of the government was the postal system. That's the main thing the government was doing. Some tariff policy, to be sure, probably hurt us, and a few other activities. And let me come back to the other issue you raised, Sam. There are millions and millions of companies in the United States. It's true that in some sectors, these are very large companies, like in manufacturing. But what I think has happened, particularly in the modern world, is these large companies are now having to compete with large companies from elsewhere. And it's not capitalism, but it's the political sector that's limiting that competition, partly at the behest of these companies, but also at the behest of the employees of these companies, to limit the competition from abroad. But most industries, it'd be hard put for you to argue now that even the large companies aren't facing significant competition in the United States markets, not only from domestic companies, from large companies based abroad.
Oh, I agree with that completely. But what I'm concerned about is this. If you look at, if you work in, say, General Motors or IBM, you're a secretary or you're a production worker, what you're getting there is you're getting orders from the top down. You don't own your work. You don't own the results of your work. When you talk about incentives from the bottom, if you want to get incentives from the bottom, you've got to get the people who work at the bottom to own the results of their work and to have a say in how their work is going to be used. You can do
Like
that if you
employee ownership?
Like employee ownership and employee control. That's what made Weirton Steel from almost at the bank of bankruptcy to one of the most successful steel companies in the United States. Employee ownership and control. Same with Columbia Aluminum, one of the most efficient aluminum companies in the United States. It went from shutdown to being a very successful company through employee ownership and employee control over their production processes. That's what I call putting incentives at the bottom where they belong. But you never advocate that.
No, I'm never against employee ownership. But you have to permit employee ownership to compete on a level playing field against other forms. We permitted that in the United States up until 1975. And you had trivial employee ownership in the United States. That, to me, suggests the workers didn't want it.
Dr. Freeman, who owns companies now? Is this, are these in the hands of a small number of people, or is it stockholders?
No, it's the stockholders who own it, and about a very large fraction of that is owned in pension plans, which are for the benefit of the employees. But of course, Gary is right. What produced the spate of employee ownership was government subsidy through the
ESOPs have been heavily subsidized since 1975.
And I think that's disgraceful.
That's the only reason you've gotten the growth of employee ownership in the United States. So we have 5,000 or 6,000 employee-owned companies now in the United States. And you take away these subsidies, and I think that'd go down to 1,000 or so. Let them be there. That's fine. But let the market determine which form is most desired, which form is most efficient.
Gentlemen, obviously we have not exhausted this subject, but we are out of time. Thank you for watching Free to Choose. Next week, we'll be discussing the failure of our schools.
We send our kids to school hoping that they'll receive something that will benefit them in the future for when they go out here and compete in the job market. Unfortunately, none of that is taking place out at Hyde Park.